Okay, I think we can start.
Excellent. Do you want to get going?
Yes. Welcome everybody to GenDispatch. Next slide, please. And also, we only have 50 minutes today, so we'll try to be short and to the point. Next slide, please. This is the note well. By now, I hope you have read it and understood it. And this is an IETF meeting. The note well applies. If you have any questions, please contact your chairs or ADs. Next slide, please. This is a list of useful links. You have the Jabber room here, our names. My name is Francesca Palombini, together with Pete Resnick. The GenDispatch mailing list, the minutes. Thank you so much to our minute takers. And I'm having a bit of problem seeing the slide.
Yeah, I noticed that it's not coming through clearly.
So let me just open them separately so I can see.
Are other people? Yeah, they're not refreshing.
Other people having problems as well.
That's not delightful.
After
part of the slide.
First part from Pete Resnick's screen.
Yeah. Let me see if I can.
It looks like you're sharing.
Them.
It looks like you're sharing the app rather than the screen, and that there are windows covering it.
Well, I am sharing the screen, not the app. So.
Yeah, there were some challenges in another session where people were having issues with doing that. I think you may want to just try to share only the window.
I'll do that. Hold on.
And maybe not have it full screen, just have it as part.
Right.
Largely on there.
Okay.
Of course, there will be such.
But problems. I posted the slides into the Jabber or the chat, so maybe while Pete is reconnecting, I can talk on the slides. So useful links, the Jabber, yes, our mails, the charter, and slide number 5, agenda. So here we are. So we are into the intro administrivia section of the agenda. Then Niels is going to take over with the draft nodal terminology. We're going to have Stephen talking about the eligibility expand document. And the Michael will take the GenDispatch draft adoption. And the last 5 minutes are not really open mic. I think that we are really short on time today, so this will be for recap. So next slide, please. This is just a slide reminder for the dispatch process. The ground rules is that we do recommend next steps for new work. We do not adopt draft, and these are the possible outcomes. So we will direct work to existing working group or propose a new focus working group. We can recommend AD sponsorship, assuming the AD is willing, and we can also recommend that the IETF should not work on this topic, and the or additional discussion or community development is required. Those are all possible outcomes. Next slide, please. Yes, participation guidelines. When you're at the mic, please remember to state your name before speaking and keep the dispatch question in mind. Keep your comments short. And if possible, request both video and audio when you join the queue.
And on this point, I want to remind folks that our point here is not to actually work the documents. There's going to be a short presentation of the document just so folks have in mind the topic, but we're not trying to actually solve the problem in this particular session. We're trying to figure out how to dispatch. So if you have questions, if you have comments that will help you figure that out or help the rest of us figure that out, that's fine, but we're not trying to solve the problem in this room.
Exactly. Thanks, Pete. And also for presenters, please tell us what would you like, what would you be the optimal outcome for you during your presentation. And on that, I think we can give Niels the floor with the first presentation.
All right.
Let's see, is this working?
Yes. Yes.
Thanks so much. Pete, can you pull up my slides?
There you go. And let me see if I can grow the window just a bit. All right.
Excellent. So I had the great pleasure to co-author this draft together with Mallory Nodal. We started doing this work in 2018, but recently interest has revived due to a sector-wide awareness on exclusionary terms. And this has created quite some conversation, both in 2018 and now as well. And we've received a remarkable amount of off-list email conversations that had quite another character than the conversations that we had on the mailing list, which I think is interesting. Next slide, please. So as you all know, RFCs are the main output of our work here. And I think what we all want is them to be relevant to a global group of people, since the internet also aspires to be a global network of networks. And since the IETF aspires to be a diverse and professional community, conform RFC 7704, we want our RFCs and IDs to be relevant and readable for as many people as possible. This will also increase the impact of our work and an exclusive community to work on the work that we're producing, and thus increase our influence and impact. Slide 3, please. Are we on non-objectives?
Yes.
So what we are explicitly not trying to do is change wording of existing RFCs and IDs. But we want to start conversations about language in current and upcoming work. We do not either want to forbid words or language or anything. What we do want is authors to take responsibility for the influence that they have. The IETF is important, not to us, but also for the world, and so is the internet infrastructure and the internet architecture. And with great power comes great responsibility. Therefore, we want to facilitate the process of making language in IDs and RFCs more inclusive by raising awareness and suggesting alternatives to authors and providing a mechanism for the RFC editor to have such a discussion with authors. Next slide, please. Well, the basics you get from reading the draft, which I'm sure you all have done. But what is important to note is that many communities adjacent to ours have already implemented this, such as GitHub, the Linux Foundation, Django, Python, some IEEE working groups, and others are in discussion, and some are also looking to IETF for guidance. But people in our community have worked on this as well, as we have seen in several RFCs. And Codespell even adopted our draft and implemented it in their tooling, which then also directly provided some tooling for parts of the work suggested. Next slide, please. So based on some excellent reviews we received, thanks a lot for that, we clarified the main goal a bit further, made the language more accessible, provided more alternatives, and removed language that was not really clarifying. Also, really thanks a lot for the excellent discussions we had on the use of robot and robotnik in the Czech language, which was a very insightful discussion, but I think it was too complex to edit in the draft. So thanks a lot for the pull requests. We removed it from the draft, but it was a good discussion. Thanks a lot. Slide 6, final slide. We do hope that this draft can become, can find its way to become an area director sponsored RFC. In a next version, we might add a reference to RFC 7704. We received on the list some excellent suggestions for other exclusionary terms, such as balkanization and third world countries, which is not a very helpful category at all. So thanks for the suggestions for additional work and directions already shared on the GenDispatch list, and really looking forward to discuss. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. On that, we open the mic line. And please, I remind you to please state your name before speaking. John.
Thank you. I really appreciate that the authors brought this up. By the way, can you hear me? Because I can't see myself.
Yes, just fine. And
okay.
that's John Levine, by the way.
Yes, I'm John Levy. I appreciate that the authors brought this up, and I think it's something we should deal with, but I do not think that this draft is a good place to start. I sent a longer message about this to the list. The discussion of slavery is way too specific to the Western Hemisphere. The discussion of blacklist is just wrong. Blacklist is about freedom of association and freedom of speech, and not about race. And it simultaneously trivializes the issue, and it gives and it ignores issues. It ignores words that have actual racial problems, like grandfather is a verb. So I would be means so. I don't know if there's any process way to say this, but I think we should work on this, but not starting from this draft.
And do you have a particular opinion of in what kind of forum you would like to work on it?
My guess is it's too complicated to be AD. It really needs a working group, because as we have seen from the discussion, a lot of people reacted to this in a lot of complicated ways, and I think it's really essential that we have meaningful consensus if we're going to get any useful work out of this. Oh, and finally, wearing my not really RFC editor hat, I absolutely am not willing to make the RFC editors into the language police. We have to implement it some other way.
All right. Jason, I saw you hop in, hop out. I'll assume that you wanted out, and you can re-add yourself to the queue. Andrew, go right ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, just fine.
Marvelous. Yes, I think this document certainly provoked an interesting discussion on the mailing list, if I can be guilty of gross understatement. I agree with the last comment that this is maybe a topic that needs to be addressed, but I don't believe this document gives a useful starting point. For example, it doesn't appear, unless I missed it in the document, to give a mechanism for how you might agree what terms, what words you should be avoided, and it simply gives some examples rather than an actual mechanism. I think that's quite a significant omission. For what it's worth, I thought the suggestion that Barbara made in the mailing list was a far more useful starting point as a process proposal, and took out some of the potential personal opinions with a requirement to give external references, which, again, agreeing with the last comment, this document sadly lacks. So it makes it much more an emotional sort of feeling. I might object to a particular phrase for no reason other than I don't like it, and that doesn't feel like a good reason for it not to be used by the rest of the world's population. To echo the last input, yes, this maybe needs to be addressed, but not in the way that this document suggests. Thank you.
And your suggestion for forum?
I'm not familiar enough with all of the forums to know how best to apologies.
No, fair enough.
Placed for that, Pete. Sorry.
Great. No, thanks for your comment.
Okay, and before next comment, I just wanted to say that we need to cut the queue. Okay, Bob, you got in, but after Bob, we need to cut the queue. Go ahead, Jason.
You can hear me okay?
Yep, just fine.
Got it. Okay, Jason Livinggood, thanks for...
Whoop! I must have misclicked. Please, just jump in directly to the floor. Don't bother requeuing yourself, Jason. No, okay, that's fine. You're in.
Not sure what happened with the audio. Anyway.
Yeah, I think the two of us clicked at the same time and ended up accidentally clicking you out. Yes.
All right, no worries. So, yeah, I mean, I do think we're splitting hairs a bit to say, like, is it a good starting point or not? I think it is a good starting point because it started discussion on an important matter, and I appreciate that it's been able to do that. So I think it's a good first step. I think, work should proceed. I don't think it matters particularly if it's, where it is. I would say probably don't go through all the administrivia of a new working group or something like this. I think it can just be a draft that lands either in some existing group or, proceeds with AD support or something like this. I'm sure if we want to spend time getting into like the nuances of this and that section, there's, you know, lots of stuff that can be streamlined and so on. But I think the core idea behind it, that there's, you know, either potentially offensive or absolutely offensive language that needs to be addressed here, is an important one, and that is the seed of how to start and move forward with it. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. Let me click Dan in.
And also after Dan, we have Rich, who just went off the queue.
Oh, popped out? Okay. So go ahead, Dan.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep, just fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, I guess I just want to echo what John said. I think that the topic is important. We want to make our drafts and RFCs much more applicable to, you know, a wider worldwide audience, and make them more easy to understand. But I do think that the whole discussion of racism and slavery is misguided and distracts from the overall message. It does also suffer a little bit from a kind of condescending racism itself that I think really we should avoid. About next steps, I almost want to say send it to the HRPC, but that's a very insular group as well, and I'm sure that, you know, it would not get the kind of review that would be needed. So I'm really not sure. I think some kind of BCP on using good metaphors is valuable, but I'm not really sure of the way forward.
Okay. And so Ted, we did have the queue cut before you jumped in. If you want to pop something into the Jabber room, and if folks, I think we're starting to hear that folks want this worked on in some forum, but this draft is not an ideal starting point. If you don't think that that's the right approach, definitely pop something into the Jabber room, and we will maybe reopen the queue for that discussion. But all right, let's Bob.
Rich before. Rich thoughts. You can just.
Oh, Rich, did you want to jump in?
Yes.
There you
go. Ahead.
Chat with Dan while I was just trying to add my video. Independent of whether or not this is a good starting point, I know that many drafts start somewhere, and by the time they're adopted, they end up somewhere fairly different. I'm strongly in favor of a working group, and then if the working group decides not to adopt this draft, so be it. But I think a working group charted to work on the issues identified by this document is the way to go. I will rest.
All right. So Bob is up next. Let me get you audio first and then video. Go ahead, Bob. There you are.
Sure, thank you. Bob Hinden, you can hear me okay?
Yep, just fine.
Good. Yeah, so I support the IETF taking this work on. I think it's important. I do like Barbara Stark's email and the IETF list quite a lot, because there is we do not have to do this from scratch. There is a lot of other groups are doing this. A lot of their information is published. We can point to it. It's a good guide. We're not the only ones thinking about this. I'm a little torn between a working group, which I agree will, there'll be a really long chartering discussion. So I guess I'm sort of leaning towards AD sponsored, but with a separate mailing list, sort of I think doing a working group for one document is probably a lot of overhead. So if we can do something a little simpler, but it needs to have a place for people to discuss, to work out what should be last called. So some sort of something intermediate like AD sponsored, maybe the IETF chair is the right person with a separate mailing list to discuss and work on the draft. And I think the last thing, I think this draft was good in that it raised the issue. I suspect when we're done, we'll want something that's more operational, if I can use that word, that sort of just describes the problem and then describes the mechanisms we're going to use and point to a list of terms that we want to avoid and suggest alternatives. I mean, I read what was in the Apple document, and I thought that was, I mean, theirs is much broader than just this topic, but I thought that's a good example. Thank you.
So I think so far I'm hearing, and someone scream, I'm looking both in the Jabber room and listening to comments. Someone scream if I've gotten this wrong, but I'm hearing people do want a forum for discussion, a mailing list of some sort. People are unclear on whether there should be a working group. It should just be a mailing list and AD sponsored once something gets done. And I'm inclined to hear from Alyssa about what she's going to be willing to take on. Alyssa, do you want to get onto the floor?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, just fine.
Yeah, really interesting discussion. Also, just noting like the dramatic difference in the tone of this discussion from the discussion on IETF at IETF. It's really noticeable. It's a little hard to know what to do here. I mean, like, I appreciate the desire to want to have a forum for discussion. I will say, like, an IETF mailing list, it seems, just based on recent evidence, to be like a really problematic way to talk about this subject. You know, extremely painful to live through the reading of and sending of many mails about this. And I feel like that exact dynamic pushes people out of the discussion who need to be there, and who are absent from it entirely in its current form, as far as I can tell. So that's an issue that I don't really know how to grapple with, because I think we need to have, you know, community discussion about this. But it's almost like having meetings like this is maybe a better way than
like
a lot of email like back and forth. So I'm not sure what to do about that. I agree with the comments that, you know, that sort of AD sponsorship of something like this seems quite fraught. But I also think we have other vehicles, like I suggested this thing about GenArt, and the ISG can, you know, adopt its own standards for what are we going to look for when we review documents, because we review every document. So I wonder if there's things that we can do in the interim while we figure out what is the nature of an RFC that would get produced, that we could work on in parallel. You know, we start with, you know, taking action based on some intermediate guidance that can be developed for the directorates or for the ISG, as we work through how do we actually come to IETF consensus about some higher level statement.
So
I know that none of that is like super useful
how close
in
are
terms
we
of coming to a conclusion.
Yeah. Francesca, how bad are we on time here?
We're really bad on time. We're 8 minutes over time already.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think this was the hardest doc that we were going to have to deal with. So I'm not too worried that we're a little over here. I'm inclined to leave the queue closed and push for a little more discussion on the list, just in terms of how to dispatch this. But what I'm hearing so far is at least let's set up a mailing list to gather the people who want to talk about this, even if the discussion on that mailing list is limited to, okay, what are we going to do with the next interim chat about this? Because this does seem like a good tone for the discussion that we've had. So
there is a clarification question that Mark has.
Go ahead, Mark. As your media fires up. There you are.
Am I here?
Wow, you're a disembodied head in blackness.
Can you hear me?
Yes, just fine.
Okay, good. So you said on the mailing list, but you didn't say what mailing list. And I say that because the IASG brought this up on the IETF list, which I was a little surprised since we have a GenDispatch list now. And I'll be a little sneaky and say I get on the queue to say that Alyssa said it's hard to have these discussions on IETF lists. I agree that it's hard to have these discussions on the IETF list because it's the Wild West. If we had a list that had good rules of engagement and solid management, I think we might have better luck. Thank you.
And I think
yeah,
Ted
we don't
said
have any list
approximately
like that. I don't think we have a list that has the rules that you need for this. So I meant what I said, IETF lists, not the IETF list. And we published the ISG statement to the IETF list because that's where we publish all ISG statements. Like if we had just posted it to the website and not told anybody, then we would have gotten flamed for that. So that's why we put it there.
So I just wanted to bring up the statement from Ted Lemon, who is in the queue, but that the IETF does a poor job of having hard discussions. If we want to have this hard discussion, I think we need to address the general problem, and more people agreeing to that. Just bringing this up.
So I feel like we don't have a solid answer to the dispatch question right now, and we could go on for the rest of the session with just that. So, I mean, I'm certainly willing to moderate the discussion on GenDispatch about the dispatch question itself. Should we set up a new mailing list for this discussion? What forum should we be having those discussions in? I hear Alyssa loud and clear that even a relatively tightly moderated mailing list is going to be tricky to have this discussion on. But I like the idea of interim meetings and working it that way. So we'll bring it to the list and hopefully we'll get a good answer quickly. Please, folks, do participate in that discussion and let's see if we can get something out of it. And we will capture what's going on in the Jabber room about this document.
Yep.
And I appreciate that discussion that's going on.
Okay.
All right.
We need to move on.
Yep. So
Stephen.
let me get to the next document here. Stephen, you're up to bat. Do you want the slide up or do you want the document up?
Slide first, and then when it comes to discussion, you can pop the document with the part that has the figures, if that's okay.
All right, I will do that.
So I'm confident this will be an easier discussion.
There's a slide.
There you go. So Brian started off the draft. I was helping out. The draft is there. The problem we're tackling, I hope everybody knows, is basically that given that non-com eligibility is determined by meeting attendance and we're not attending in person, something has to be done. Something was done for this year already. The question arises, how do we handle the next couple of years? This is a proposal for that as a process experiment, which essentially means it can run for kind of 3 years. And then if nothing else happens, we go back to revert to the status quo. It defines some other routes by which you could become eligible. We can have a look at a picture there of the effect of that. I personally would hope that this might be something that could be appropriate for AD sponsorship for 2 reasons. One is we kind of need an answer soon-ish, not immediately, but soon-ish. And secondly, SHMU, if there are longer-term issues and things to think about, there is a working group there, SHMU, which could watch this process experiment happen and then see what to do about it longer term. And then there's a mailing list for this already, eligibility discuss. Then the only other thing is if you could pop the picture of the Venn diagrams. The first one should be fine.
Yeah.
So in the draft itself, we had this proposal some months ago, I think back around Easter time. A few people said, what are the numerical kind of consequences of the proposal? And Robert Sparks kind of helped me to get started to try and produce an answer to that. I did produce an answer. Some people said, oh, this is a slightly other question. And then I totally dropped the ball. So I apologize for that. But then eventually Robert picked it up again. And so the current draft, if you look at the nice HTML version, does have some Venn diagrams, more or less indicate that if we applied these new rules, the population of people who could be non-com eligible wouldn't be hugely different numerically, but it's a Venn diagram, so you can see from the pictures in it, and if they do pop up on the screen at some point, that there is overlaps, but there's also non-overlaps. Great.
We're going to have the refresh problem if I do it that way, but let's see.
Yeah, it'll fix eventually, I guess. That's basically all I had to say. Again, the ask here, I think, is finish discussion on the list to the point where people get happy with it, and then hopefully try and find an AD who's willing to sponsor it. Which could be this or somebody else, I guess. So that's all I had to say, I think.
And we got Ted in the queue. Go ahead.
Ted Hardy speaking. And you're about to have another TED. You'll have TED on TED any minute now. Thanks very much for writing the draft. I disagree, however, that this is appropriate for AD sponsorship, in part because it's doing too many experiments in one document. It talks about participation models along multiple different axes and tries to experiment with them all at once. And I think the result of that is going to need some considerable forging before it would be appropriate for 3933. So I think the simpler thing to do here is to go ahead and have the working group discussion either in SHMU or a little mini working group and forge out which ones of these we actually want to consider. And I'll just take two quick examples from the draft that illustrate the point. One of the things the draft says right now is that it will continue to allow, it will permit non-com participation by anybody who was in an IESG or IEB sponsored formal role anytime in the last 5 years. And we have some of those formal roles like IANA experts or liaisons from the IEB who have been in them for many, many, many years because of their focused expertise in a specific area, but who have not attended an IETF either in person or remotely for many years as well. So I think it's important for us to have discussions about what IETF participation models actually are. And if you wanted to do something right now, you could do a much simpler thing by saying, for any meeting where there was no in-person meeting, registration for the remote meeting counts as an in-person meeting, and we'll experiment with that until we get back to discovering what our new in-person meeting cadence looks like. But I think this is too complicated a proposal to do as AD sponsored. So I would suggest either trumping the queue at SHMU to do this first there, or a focused mini working group. Thanks.
Okay, just to react to that, so I guess I don't agree that this proposal is too complicated. Knowing what the upshot of the proposal is and how it impacts on who gets randomly selected for non-com is complicated. So I don't think the proposal is. So I guess I would disagree to some extent about it being too complicated for AD sponsorship, but I think, yeah, your point is taken that any set of new eligibility rules will have hard to foresee consequences, which I think is that's a good reason to do it as an experiment, whether we take what you suggest, Ted, or what we would ask for.
Okay, Michael, I think you're up to bat.
I never imagined that expert reviewers were in I-STAR expert roles. So I don't think we intended that. Did we, Stephen? I don't think so. I think we meant IAB, IESG. That's what I think we meant, but I could be wrong. If you think that this one's too complicated, then you should see the one we didn't propose, which was there were many, many more complicated things. And I thought that we tried to narrow it down to one or two things at a time. And you think that we failed at that. So I take your point that we need to do something small. I don't think we need to jump. We can jump into SHMU. I think the whole point of this exercise in SHMU is that SHMU shouldn't be rushed, but that we have a problem starting in March 2021, and we should let people know enough in advance so they know what it is that they need to do before that point to become eligible. So that's why I think there's some urgency to this, and I think that the setup that we've got is pretty small at this point.
Okay, next in queue, Robert.
So I would also strongly encourage not just moving this discussion into the SHMU list. While SHMU needs to pay attention eventually, I think that it would be a distraction from the topics that SHMU really should be focusing on initially. I would be happy with a small focused working group. But I also think that it would get the exposure and participation that it needed if discussion continued to happen on its existing list.
Thanks. Sam, you're up to bat.
I would like to see us put something into place on intermeasure, even if it perhaps not as an experiment, recognizing that the need for this is not just once a year for the normal NOMCOM. It might come up at another time because of recall committees. And so I'm concerned that the temporary fix we put in place for this NOMCOM doesn't address that edge case.
And I think that was mentioned on the eligibility discuss list some time ago. Good point.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing anyone else in the queue. I don't know that I've heard a solid answer to what to do with it. Alyssa? I don't have sound from you, Alyssa, just video.
Let me take the pause, ensure that everybody can hear me now.
Yep.
Yes. So, I mean, I think it sounds like people want to get something done fast because we have a timeline, and it already has its own list. And I appreciate Ted's comment, but I guess I'm not going to suggest that you use the hum tool if you don't want to, but I would like to maybe get a sense from people if anybody is really, or the extent to which people are really opposed to doing this as AD sponsored and using the existing list for continued discussion, because it is a process experiment.
That's a question I'm willing to do a hum for using the tool. So I'm going to push the hum tool just to get people, if you object to it being an AD sponsored document using the current eligibility discuss list to discuss any issues, please hum, and I will push the magic button. All right. Hum away if you object to having this as AD sponsored and discussing on eligibility discuss open issues. You
waiting for the music.
Still has 15 seconds. Oh, that's very nice. Thank you. Very good. All right. So we had a few people. It came up pianissimo. So we had a few people who do object. Is there anything that beyond what Ted said at the mic that people want to jump in because you have a different view of why we shouldn't do that? That we haven't heard before? All right. I mean, I'm inclined to say that is a rough opinion of objection. That it's not a loud objection. So if you wanted to go forward in that direction, I think, Alyssa, that's probably perfectly reasonable. I don't think there's been shouting of objection.
Okay. I think we can move forward.
Yeah, I think we'll call that dispatched. We'll, for the current time being, if there's additional discussion on the content of the document, Eligibility discuss is where it's being discussed. And Alyssa's going to take on the document and see if we can move it forward that way.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Moving on to our next topic.
Yes, and you only have 10 minutes, but it would be great if you will make it in shorter than that, Michael.
So me? Am I next?
Yes, you are up to bat.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes, quite.
Okay, so Brian, Fernando, and I came together from different points of views to talk about the question of how working groups adopt documents. Next slide, please. Probably better in full screen. You can hit down, but anyway, whatever. So we'd like to think that this is how documents go through, and you may know that over the years, I guess there's been a lot of attention to the right-hand side to making the RFC Publication Center work faster. Lots of discussion yesterday at the plenary to making the IESG part go faster. But we're really focused on the part to the far left between the individual draft and the working group adoption. And we kind of would like to think that that's how it looks. Next slide, please. But what we actually see is that this is what we think happens, is that individual drafts cycle this, and one person say, oh, I don't want to bother the working group until I have my solution is perfect. I needed to tell that person, well, that sounds like a version of imposter syndrome to me, because I think that the working group should maybe participate in making it perfect. And actually, there's a really terrible situation, we think, which is the next slide, please. Which is when some group of people, sometimes worst case, an external SDO, goes off, thinks a whole bunch, shows up and says, hey, we have this perfect solution, please adopt it and publish it. And then we get a bunch of, well, hang on here, what's going on? We've adopted it, we find all these problems, and then there's a lot of resistance to actually changing it. This isn't pathology, I think, that almost all of us have seen in at least one or two working groups on a regular basis. And it's exactly this kind of thing that we really think we're trying to avoid, and that's why we really think that working groups should adopt the documents much earlier. Next slide, please. The problem is that working groups have different notions as to what it means to adopt a document. And there was another document previously written that says, what does it mean? And this document says it's a commitment that the working group will spend time and effort on the draft, but it does not guarantee the draft will reach working group consensus or be published. The critical thing in my mind is always, if the document is adopted, then you can put it on the agenda. And there's not a lot of other criteria in my mind. So this document tries to clarify things for things. At this point, working group chairs have the prerogative to do it any way they like, and that's fine. But I think that part of what we want them to do is be a little more clear what will their prerogative be and how should people react in that group, so they know ahead of time what to expect. Next slide, please. I think that's almost the last one. Yeah, I just said that. Continue on, please. So we think that they should adopt documents as soon as they can agree on the problem statement. We have some dispute as to whether or not they should adopt documents automatically when they're the result of design teams, but that's something we could discuss if we find a home for this. Next slide, please. And the options seem to be 80 sponsored or some kind of mini working group to do this in. That's it for me.
All right. Joel, you're up to bat.
Michael, let's start from the good point. I agree it would help us if we reached agreement on what adoption meant and wrote it down, because it's written down clearly, and I have no disagreement with that part of the document. On the other hand, your criteria I completely disagree with.
Fair enough.
adoption has nothing to do with whether it gets agenda time. In all of the working groups I've been involved in, and I've been involved in a lot of different working groups, as have you, working group time on agendas is there is interest in the working group in discussing it. Adoption by the working group for me, and this has been my co-chairs and other people I've worked with, represents the working group agrees this is a good basis for working. Not the right answer, not done. You're absolutely right, it doesn't need to be polished, but it represents a good basis for the working group to work from. Just plain anything that's going to get worked on gets adopted by the working group actually creates a mess for the working group, because other people outside the IETF will see that as the working group has said they like this. Well, they haven't. And frankly, I like being able to sort what has the working group adopted and agreed if this is a good basis, and what is still being discussed as, is this the right place to start? Do we need a different place to start? That's why we have individual
What if
ideas.
we had a new milestone, Joel? What if we had something that was in between?
I don't understand the value proposition for it. I can believe there might be some, but as currently constructed with the stages we have, I really don't like the paradigm you've laid out.
Fair enough. Where would you like to continue this discussion, though?
Well, I think this actually belongs on IETF, but that gets crowded. But this is not. This is a discussion that affects everybody in the IETF, because it would affect all working groups if we changed these rules.
Okay. Next, Bron. Go ahead.
My question is, what gets adopted in this case? Is it just a document that says problem statement, basically a draft that has an abstract and nothing else, or does it need to be a somewhat fully fleshed document that looks like a full draft?
I don't think
security
that we're
considerations
trying to suggest. I don't think we're trying to suggest this strongly. I think we're trying to suggest that working groups need to be clear of what it is they expect, and as Joel said, so that everyone can know what it means, and so that you would know coming forward what it is you need to produce to get it to adoption.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, next, Bob. Go ahead.
Hi, Bob Hinden. Yeah, I support, I think we need a general set of rules for what adoption means. I think I've seen a lot of cases where adoption has turned into about the same thing as working group last call. And so it's gotten moved easy, or yeah, it shouldn't be that hard to adopt. But I'm also agreeing with Joel a bit, is that it you know, there needs to be a document that you can work on. But so a lot of it, I think, is working whether the working group thinks this is a problem that it should solve. In Six-Man, we're trying a different thing with a document that we agreed is a problem to solve, but we didn't. There was a lot of disagreement about the proposed solution, so we instructed the author to publish a working group document that took all the solutions out, you know, left them as TBD, and then we want to have them discuss one by one on the mailing list to see what we actually agree with. So yeah, so I think something like this should be done. I'm not exactly sure where to do it either.
Which document in Six-Man is doing this?
This is the flash renumbering document.
Thank you.
Okay, we have officially 1 minute left. So I'll ask the queue to be really quick. Adrian, go ahead.
Thanks, I can talk really fast. I'm concerned about introducing rules for this sort of thing. I think that we do not want to close down the flexibility in how working groups are run for different circumstances. And maybe the right approach is to look at this in the context of RFC 7221, which tries to describe the process around this and say what is missing there, and maybe tighten that document up a little.
So 7221 bis.
If that's what it takes.
Where to do it?
It's so small that I would say it's so small that just do it.
Many agreements on the jabber.
Okay. Last comment, Rudiger.
I would like to re-emphasize Joel's comment that for adoption, it is essential that the draft brought in is considered good in some way. I think I have seen too many adoptions where people were shy to do the discussion why it is a bad idea or why it is, well, okay. And that may mean that actually the discussion and the real judgment only happens as a big discussion at at last call, which obviously is much more unreasonable than having a discussion and an evaluation at the adoption. I do not think that measures for ensuring this need to be a fixed rule over all the working groups, but giving the working group chairs some language that they can actually adopt for the working group if this is this problem shows up. Certainly would be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. We are 2 minutes over time right now, so I think we need to stop this discussion.
And so I mentioned in the Jabber chat, Francesca and I have been chatting in a separate window. It sounds to me, well, it sounds to me like we should have asked for 2 hours instead of 1, but it sounds to me like we need an interim to sort some of this for GenDispatch to find a reasonable way to get these dispatched. Alyssa, are you okay with that idea? And should we go ahead and just figure out the soonest possible time to do that?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Because I think just watching the Jabber room, there's a lot of discussion that needs to be sorted to get these things dispatched appropriately. Because I don't have a good sense on this document whether we've got consensus on where to dispatch it and how.
Yeah, and I think that this 7221 bis discussion can continue productively on the list.
Yeah. Okay.
In the meantime, when we can continue discussion in the list while we plan an interim.
Right. So discussion of dispatching this will continue on GenDispatch, and I encourage everyone here to please join. It's not high volume. And discussion of of eligibility will happen on eligibility to discuss. And if you want to talk about content of that document, and I think Francesca and I will get together and send out a message to GenDispatch to try and arrange for an interim real soon.
Yes, thanks everybody for joining. Thank you to our minute takers. And yes, please join us in Gathertown.
We will be there.
Bye.
All right. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.